Imagine, if you can, this morning that you have just become the next leader of the greatest nation on earth. How do you feel? Nervous? Worried? Not qualified? Now imagine that you've just become the leader of the greatest nation on earth following the death of the greatest leader in the history of that nation. You feel the pressure starting to build. Now imagine that you just become the leader of the greatest nation on earth following the death of the most loved leader in that nation's history. And you've become this leader at the most critical time in that nation's history. How do you feel about your new job? Overwhelmed? Full of pressure? Are you worried? Imagine leading a people whose long history of fighting between themselves has almost ripped a nation apart. They have rebelled against their leaders to the point where they've almost put them to death on many occasions. And now, at this most critical time in their history, they turn to you and ask you to lead them into this uncertain future. I imagine none of us have been under that kind of pressure, that kind of stress. I can only imagine the sleepless nights that we might experience, knowing full well that the slightest mistake in our leadership might lead this rowdy bunch to rebel. Knowing full well that the slightest mistake in our leadership might get this fickle-minded people and turn them in a direction that will impact the course of this nation forever. Imagine leading a people so fickle-minded into a future that is so uncertain, especially knowing that the person who tried to do this before you was assassinated the day before. That's precisely where Andrew Johnson found himself, the 17th President of the United States, on April 15, 1865. Just a week earlier, Robert E. Lee, the commander of the Army of Virginia, surrendered that army at Appomattox Courthouse on April 7, 1865. And just 7 days later, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., having never seen the end of the Civil War, which he so courageously dedicated himself to ending. Here was a nation fragmented by ideologies, war-torn and bloodied, looking at one man to put them back together as a nation and lead them forward into a very uncertain future. Andrew Johnson was that man. He had no formal education. He was trained as a tailor, and he had been Vice President of the United States for just 3 months. I suspect that Andrew Johnson had many sleepless nights as the President of the United States. And I would not be a bit surprised if the same were not true for Joshua in our story this morning. Like Andrew Johnson, he found himself assuming leadership of a rebellious and stiff-necked people, following in the footsteps of their most beloved leader and at the most critical time in that nation's history. So when Moses is speaking to the people, telling them that he will not be leading them into the promised land, but instead Joshua will go ahead with you, Joshua must have heard those words with abject terror and not a little bit of worry. I'm sure he was thinking, "You've got to be kidding. Who in their right mind would want to lead this people, especially at this point in our history?" Like Andrew Johnson, I suspect Joshua anticipated many sleepless nights as the leader of the people of Israel. That's why Moses in verse 6 tells him, "Be strong and courageous, do not fear," a command that he repeats only 2 verses later. Fear and worry about the future, unfortunately, are not reserved just for great leaders of great people. It's a problem that's common to us all. We all look to the future with uncertainty, and that uncertainty creates fear and worry within us. We lay awake at night worrying how we're going to pay the bills that are coming due, how to discipline the child that is in rebellion, what to say to the person at work. We wonder, who will I marry? How will I retire? And what will my legacy be? We as a people have this almost innate need to understand what's going to happen in the future. And not just understand it, but deep down inside we have a desire to control it. And it is almost as if we think that if we know what the future will be, we can change the course of the future in a way that is best for us, like we even know what is best for us. But it's because we have a need to understand the future that we are often the close companion of worry and fear. And evidently, so was Joshua. For twice do we read in these few verses, and 3 times does God repeat in the first part of the book of Joshua, do not fear, do not be afraid. Joshua, God tells him, do not worry about the future. And so this morning I'd like to study with you God's Word in order to find a cure for worry, a relief from fear. God's Word this morning shows us how we can eliminate fear from our lives. And God gives us a 3-pronged approach to dealing with fear in our lives. And before we look at those, I want to say 2 things about this approach. First, notice that all 3 points begin with the letter R. All 3 points. Realize that the Lord goes before you. Recognize that the Lord goes with us. And finally, rest in the covenant faithfulness of our God. 3 R's. And that is so that when worry comes knocking at your door, you can remember those 3 things. But the second thing I want you to see about this cure for worry this morning is that we do not contribute to the solution. All we do is acknowledge what God has done and will do. This is not a self-help book on how to overcome fear. This is not a 3-step approach that if you master it, you will eliminate fear in your life. Fear is banished not because of what we can accomplish or master within ourselves. Fear and worry flee when we recognize, realize, and rest in the presence of God. Let's take a look at this 3-step approach now that we find in our passage this morning. The first step to eliminating worry in our lives is to realize that the Lord goes before us. Look at Deuteronomy 31, verse 1. Then Moses went out and spoke these words to all of Israel. I'm now 120 years old, and I'm no longer able to lead you. The Lord has said to me, you will not cross the Jordan. The Lord your God himself will cross over ahead of you. He will destroy these nations before you, and you will take possession of their land. Joshua and Israel now stand on the west bank of the Jordan River, looking across the river at the promised land, a land which flows with milk and honey, a land that is so fertile that grapes grow in massive clusters and grain fields are thick with grain. But they also know from the spies who were there before that this is a land of fortified cities and giants. Fortified cities and giants. And these are desert dwellers. They're almost completely unarmed. They have no military experience or military weapons. And here they stand looking out over the object of God's promise. And they most certainly must have asked themselves, now what? Now what? How can we possibly take possession of that which God has promised? We don't have the experience. We don't have the weapons of war to breach walls or attack fortified cities. How is it possible for us to obtain that which God has promised? And to make matters worse, Moses isn't leading the way. Israel, and I'm sure Joshua, understood and recognized the impossibility of their situation. And so does Moses. And that's why Moses now prepares his people for what is about to happen. And the first thing he tells them is that, remember, when you are faced with an impossible situation, realize that the Lord your God will cross over ahead of you. A 2011 study was done of the American people. And the question would ask, what is your number one temptation? You know what the number one temptation of Americans were in 2011? Worry. Over 60% of American people said that they worried about something every single day. Lisa Miller, in her article, Listening to Xanax, and if you don't know it, Xanax is a prescription medication for dealing with anxiety. But in her article, Listening to Xanax, Lisa Miller said that Americans have learned finally to stop worrying about worry. Now they just pop a pill. Lisa goes on to say that the decade of 2010 is the era of Xanax. The American solution for stress, it seems, is to take a pill. God's solution for worry is for us to realize that the Lord goes before us. Pastor David Lindner, who leads the ministry in Sacramento that we now support, is a very entertaining young man and yet profound in his entertainment. And he has a saying that he likes to use. He says, God never slaps his head. Think about that. What, Joshua? Jericho's not a fortified city? Why didn't I think of that before? What, you're losing your house to a foreclosure because you were laid off work? How did I not know the economy was going to turn bad? No. God never gets caught off guard by our circumstances. He never slaps his head. And the reason is because whatever situation we are facing, God always goes there before us. And because he was always going there before us, he not only knows what we're going through, but he has already determined the outcome. And Joshua, as he and the people of Israel prepare to enter the promised land, the Lord already knew that they were going to have to cross the Jordan at the time of year when the Jordan was running at the flood stage. So God simply parted the river and allowed them to walk through on dry land. Because he always went ahead of Israel, he knew that when Israel entered the promised land, they would be facing fortified cities. And as they come up on their very first one, Jericho, God knows that they don't have battering rams and catapults. So he simply breaks the wall down by himself. At no time was God ever surprised or caught off guard or baffled by the circumstances that Israel was going to face. He never slaps his head, because our text tells us the Lord your God himself will cross over ahead of you. You see, you and I have never faced an impossible circumstance, a frightening situation, or an uncertain future, but that God hasn't already gone ahead of us in that situation. When all we see is a river of difficulty running at flood stage, when our problems look so big as to be a fortified wall, realize that the Lord your God will cross over ahead of you. You will face no difficulty, no uncertainty that your God hasn't already determined how to resolve. You see, with him there are no uncertain futures.